Hello everyone, and welcome to my second video on chapter 17. And as we discussed in the previous video, there are three methods, 1, 2, 3, to allocate overhead costs. But in this video, we're just focusing on the plant-wide overhead rate. And that is the most simple of the three. So where we left off on the last video, we had discussed the 4 steps in the overhead allocation process, and we got through step 1. So now we're moving on to step 2, which is selecting an allocation base or cost driver. Okay. Now we've actually heard this term cost driver before. We learned it in chapter 15. And a cost driver is an activity that causes costs to occur. So the example I gave you in chapter 15 was those 2 beautiful dresses, but one was covered in sequins and beads. And so that one takes a lot longer for someone to make because they have to hand sew every single one of those sequins and beads. So what we're saying is that direct labor can be a cost driver for overhead costs, meaning that the longer it takes to make a dress, the more direct labor hours it takes, but also the more overhead cost it takes, right? All of the rent, all of the utilities, the supervisor's time, right? It all takes up more of that. So we're saying that direct labor costs drive overhead costs. In other words, cause that dress to incur more overhead costs. Now, in the plant-wide method, we use only one cost driver. And the cost drivers used in plant-wide overhead could be, have to be volume-based. Now, that term volume-based refers to like the amount of production or the amount of units produced. Okay? In other words, the more units you make, the more time it takes, right? So usually these volume-based measures are going to be based on time, and it could be machine hours or direct labor hours. Okay? Machine hours, if you're making more product, you're going to have more time on the machine to make more product. If it's direct labor hours, if it's something that's more handmade, the more products you make, the more direct labor hours you're going to use. So your plant-wide overhead rate, you have to choose just one. So even though we have data here for the machine hours and the direct labor hours, you only choose one. And so you can do whatever makes more sense for your business, right? If you have a product that's mostly made by machine, you might pick machine hours. If you have a product that's mostly made by hand, you might pick direct labor hours. But really all products kind of use a combination of both. So you just have to pick whichever one you want to use. And so in this example, we're going to use direct labor hours. So that's going to be our cost driver or our activity base or our allocation base. They all mean the same thing. And so we're going to take our direct labor hours from the mixing department and from the baking department, because remember, every product has to go through both, and say, okay, we're going to add those total direct labor hours together, and that becomes our allocation base. So our total direct labor hours is 100,000 direct labor hours. So now we're going to go to step 3, and step 3 is to compute the allocation rate. And to do that, you need information from steps 1 and steps 2. So with the plant-wide overhead rate, remember we only had one pool of costs and we only had one cost driver. So therefore, we're only going to calculate one allocation rate. Now again, this is the most simple, so that's why it's only one. But when we go on to the more complex methods, you're going to have to do this calculation more than once. But again, if you know how to do it once, you should be able to know how to do it more than once. So let's make sure we know how to do it once now. Okay, so this formula, guess what? You've seen it before. Okay, this is the exact same formula as the predetermined overhead rate formula from chapter 15. And what this formula tells us, right, it's an overhead rate or an allocation rate. But what it means is the expected relationship between overhead costs and an activity base or cost driver. Okay, because remember, this is not a math class. All of these numbers mean something, and I want you to understand what it means. What it means is we're saying that for every direct labor hour, it's causing that product to use up more overhead cost, rent, utilities, supervisor, etc. So this tells us, quantifies that amount. For every direct labor hour, how much overhead costs is that product using? And again, this is based on an estimate. There's no way to know for certain. This is just an estimate. And again, the term that they're going to use in the book is budgeted, but it means the same thing as estimated. Okay, budgeted means a plan of what I think I'm going to spend on something. Estimate, same thing. Okay, so this was the formula that I gave you in chapter 15. Same thing, except they use the word budgeted in chapter 17, but it's estimated overhead cost divided by estimated activity base. So the estimated overhead costs we found in step 1 were 1,320,000. The estimated activity base we found in step 2 was 100,000 direct labor hours. So if you do the math, it comes out to $13.20 of overhead costs for every direct labor hour spent on a product. Okay, that's what that number means. All right, now we are moving on to step 4, which is to assign or allocate overhead to products. And in order to do that, we need the rate that we calculated in step 3. Okay, so where we are in the process of this overhead allocation is, we pulled our costs, that's all here. We figured out our activity base or cost driver, which was direct labor hours. We calculated our allocation rate, which tells us the relationship between the cost driver and the costs. And now we're here, we're allocating, meaning we're going to say how much overhead goes into product A and how much overhead goes into product B. So we're actually doing this part, distributing it out to each product, okay? So the way it looks in our formula that we use is, again, we've seen this formula before. It's the same formula as applying overhead from chapter 15. So those 3 words, I call them the A words because they all start with A and they all mean the same thing. So I don't want you to get confused when you see the book use all 3 of these different words. They all mean the same thing. Assign, allocate, apply. It's all the same thing. It all means distributing those costs to the actual products. And so, yeah, this is pretty much the exact same slide that I gave you in chapter 15. But your overhead applied or allocated or assigned is your overhead rate from step 3 times your actual activity, which is the actual amount of your cost driver. So, for example, your direct labor hours. Okay, so in our sample problem, the data that you have here is the actual product data for each product, right? So we have cookies and we have cakes, and it tells us how many units of each we made, and it tells us how much resources we used to make these products, these cookies and cakes. Well, we use this many machine hours, and again, it's from both departments, mixing and baking, and this many direct labor hours, again, from both departments, mixing and baking. Okay, same thing here with cakes. We made 9,800 cakes, and in order to make those 9,800 cakes, we used this many machine hours from mixing and baking department and this many direct labor hours from the mixing and baking department. Okay, but when you go to, let's go back to the formula. So the formula is overhead rate times actual activity. So even though we have activity for both machine hours and direct labor hours, you want to be consistent. And you have to choose the activity that was from your activity base that you chose in step 2. So we chose direct labor hours, so we're going to disregard these machine hours for now and only do our calculation on the direct labor hours. Again, because that's what we chose in step 2. We want to stay consistent. Okay, so our actual activity, we're going to take our actual direct labor hours again from both departments, but for each product. So we calculate each product separately. That's what we're trying to do, is to allocate the cost to what belongs to cookies and what belongs to cakes. Okay, so I just added those together. Cookies took 5,650 direct labor hours and cakes took 6,200 direct labor hours. Then I multiply that times the overhead rate from step 3. And again, it's the same overhead rate for both, right? Because we only calculated one rate, $13.20 for every direct labor hour and $13.20 for every direct labor hour. So what that tells us is that if we multiply that out, the overhead from making these 54,500 cookies was $74,580. And the overhead for making 9,800 cakes was $81,840. Okay. Now, sometimes a problem will ask you to come up with the overhead costs per unit. Okay. Meaning, what were the costs for each cookie? What were the costs for each cake? So what you would do in order to do that is you would just take the total costs assigned divided by the number of cookies you made. And that comes out to $1.36 of overhead costs per cookie. That means each cookie uses $1.36 of rent, utilities, supervisor, etc. Did the same thing for cakes. We have 81,840 total overhead required to make 9,800 cakes. So that means each cake took $8.35 of overhead, rent, utilities, supervisor, etc. for each cake. And sometimes you'll need that information if the problem asks you specifically for the total cost. Because remember, total cost is direct materials, direct labor, and factory overhead. So they may ask you what is the total cost of the cookie. So you would add in your direct materials, your direct labor, and then the factory overhead for the cookie that you just calculated from step 4. And then you have your complete cost information so that you can make those pricing decisions and those product mix decisions and those cost control decisions that you need for in order to run your business successfully. But remember, I told you the plant-wide method was the simplest method, right? But there's a problem with that. Okay, the problem with the plant-wide rate is that different departments use different costs and have different cost drivers. So for example, in the mixing department, they mostly use these like giant industrial mixers. So there's going to be like one person who's running the machine, but the machine pretty much does everything. But in the baking department, it's a much more manual process. You see, there's all of these people who have to lay out the cookies on a cookie sheet before it can go in the oven. So it's a much more manual process. So when you think about the cost drivers, should we use machine hours or direct labor? I would think for the mixing department, since it's mostly a machine that does it, you would use machine hours, whereas the baking department, you would mostly use direct labor because it's more of a manual process. But the plant-wide rate makes you choose just one. So that's where the departmental rate comes in. The departmental rate allows you to choose a different rate for each department depending on what makes the most sense for that department. So with the departmental method, so the plant-wide method, you choose only one rate. It's a volume-based rate, either machine hours or direct labor hours. But for departmental, you can choose 2 or more rates depending on how many departments you have, and they're based, but it's still based on volume-based measures, so machine hours or direct labor hours. But what's the problem with that? That's where activity-based costing comes in. Okay? Because some overhead activities aren't driven by volume-based measures such as machine hours or direct labor hours, right? Take, for example, the janitor. Is the janitor's time really impacted by how many hours the machine runs or how many, direct labor hours the other workers work? It's not. A better cost driver for the janitor might be something like square footage, right? Like how big is the factory space that he has to clean? So for situations where volume-based drivers don't make sense, you might want to use activity-based costing. And what activity-based costing does is it has many rates for different activities, regardless of which department it's in, because the janitor cleans in all departments. And the cost driver is based on the activity drivers, whatever makes sense for those activities. So we'll talk more about these other 2 methods in class later, but I wanted you to just get a brief overview. And again, make sure that you understand the plant-wide method so you're ready to move on to more complex things in class.